Welcome, everybody. We are recording this session, FYI. So if you want to do whatever you need to do with your camera and other things. I am Amira Jarmakani. I use she, they pronouns, and I am uh, part of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. I'm a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective and um, also. I'm at San Diego State University in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. I'm really excited and honored to be here to listen to Sara Fatallah, our first in our speaker series, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism speaker series, which will just consider new works in critical Zionism studies. So stay tuned for more on that. Um, I just wanted to open by grounding us a little bit in where we are and what goes on around us, though I don't have much more grounding than that to call us to keep it with us in our hearts and on our minds. I have notes. I started notes to say things like, today is the fill in the number day of the unprovoked illegal criminal joint U.S.-Israel attacks on Iran, to talk about its expansion into the, I mean, expansion is not a word that can even hold what is unfolding in Lebanon and south of Lebanon and moving steadily north, displacing close to 1 million people. Um, the statistics I might collect to name, and they just don't capture. Uh, Simultaneously, as we know, of course, in Gaza and the West Bank, everything is intensifying. People are under siege, in lockdown, and not receiving basic anything, um, in many ways. And so all the more what we do is gather together. So we are gathering together here to talk today about this topic, which is so incredibly connected, of course, and relevant to all that is happening and unfolding around us in the world. Um, just to give one small example, um, I could draw our attention to the opening. A Pentagon probe has recently finally just admitted that this opening strike on the girls' school in Manab in Iran, killing at least 165 people, mostly schoolgirls, was a U.S. strike. And what has been alluded to by a lot of folks, but not overtly named, is the role of AI and on that strike. So that's something that we can talk more about in the Q&A and think more about together. But one thing that it really highlights for us, among other things, is just the role of information warfare, the incredibly potent, salient, and powerful role of information warfare in all that unfolds around us. Um, so I will offer that as a way, a kind of thread that can carry us through. And with no further ado, introduce Sara Fatallah, who um, is here with us today. Sara Fatallah is a surveillance and carceral technologies researcher and community organizer, an MST candidate in AI ethics and society at the University of Cambridge. Sara's research examines the carceral impacts of surveillance technologies on colonial subjects, criminalized communities, and migrants. As a Mariam Abu Daqqa Fellow with Hemli, the Arab Center for the Advancement of Social Media, Sara investigates Israel's systems of voice surveillance and their impacts on Palestinians. Beyond their academic and research work, Sara is involved in anti-surveillance, abolitionist, and anti-imperialist community organizing and campaigning. And we're, as I mentioned, super thrilled to have them speak to us today.
Thank you so much, Amira. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. I really appreciate this very kind introduction. Hopefully, there will be no technical snafus. Can everybody see my slides? Okay, great. Um, Thank you. So I am going to talk today about sort of artificial intelligence in the case of Palestine. This is based on a paper that was recently published in Public Humanities special issue called Palestine is Paradigm: How Gaza Transformed the World. And you may have seen this headline already. I think it's really made the round where it really brought to mainstream light the use of target generation systems that were powered by artificial intelligence and that were used by Israel to identify targets to bombard in Gaza. Um, these investigations really sort of garnered newfound attention, but they have been documented to being used since at least 2021, and also follow a decades-long history of killings of Palestinians at the hands of Israeli occupation forces and settlers. So my presentation today tries to contextualize these technologies within Israel's settler colonial project and racial capitalist economy. So first, I want to talk a little bit about settler colonialism relationship to labor to understand like Palestinians' role in Israel's racial capitalist economy. And then I want to add that logic of experimentation motivates the way that Israel exerts control over Palestinians in order for them to become a leading weapons exporter. And then third, I want to demonstrate that when invoked in service of AI systems, this experimentation requires that data is dispossessed both from Palestinian life and death. And then lastly, I'll describe how this dual dispossession places Palestinians in a form of algorithmic death world. When we talk about sort of settler colonial regimes, they can appear to be incompatible with systems of racial capitalism and their demands for labor exploitation. And settler colonial studies scholars describe the difference between franchise or regular colonialism and settler colonialism as the difference between a demand from labor and demand to go away. And going away can be achieved through different means, and we've seen in history that it included the expulsion, mass killings, forced assimilation of indigenous populations. But the common denominator really is that settler colonialism requires the systematic erasure of indigenous peoples from the land so that you can replace them with settlers. So, whereas franchise colonialism is sustained by a logic of exploitation, meaning that it is determined to exploit indigenous peoples for their labor, settler colonialism is animated by a logic of elimination that aims at establishing a settler society on expropriated land. So while this dichotomy between exploitation and elimination is established in settler colonial studies literature, it is troubled when you look at the particular case of apartheid South Africa. And here I want to name that I draw from the work of Andy Clarno and his book Neoliberal Apartheid, where he compares racial capitalism in apartheid South Africa and in Palestine. So when we look at South Africa, beginning in 1600s, European settlement first relied on eliminatory practices that violently displaced Africans in order to conquer the land. But then come the late 1800s, that dynamic shifted as white-owned mines, factories, farms became dependent on the exploitation of the low-wage labor of Black workers, which in some ways prevented their total elimination. So rather than conceiving of elimination and exploitation as opposing logics, a sort of more nuanced historical frame accounts for shifting logics. So in the case of South Africa, a process that at one point sought the elimination of the Black population shifted into one that's primarily organized around their labor exploitation. So then bringing this back to Palestine, the opposite shift occurred, where labor exploitation came to have a decreasing role in Israel's racial capitalist economy. So when you think about starting in 1948 and through the mid-1980s, Palestinians did provide low-wage labor to Israel's economy, mostly in agriculture and construction. But then throughout the neoliberal restructuring of the Israeli economy, starting in the 1980s, that project really was explicit in its aims to decrease its reliance on Palestinian workers as it shifted away from industrial and agricultural industries. It started moving production to neighboring countries through sort of free trade agreements, and instituted a restrictive work permit regime for Palestinians, all the while importing large numbers of foreign workers. So to me, that begs the question, if elimination is central to Israel's settler colonial project, but labor exploitation was made unnecessary to its economies, what logic better characterizes how Israel subjugates Palestinians into its racial capitalist system? So now we look at sort of this idea of experimentation. Um, Carceral geography studies actually offer us a framework to help understand how Israel devalues Palestinians, because we know that racialized populations have a long history of being subjected to experimentation within the confine of carceral geographies. And by that, I mean broadly, not just prison spaces, but plantations, refugee camps, borders, and other carceral spaces. And what these spaces have in common, in addition to sort of containment of movement, is also the coercive sites of human experimentation. And we've seen this. So Israel's racial capitalism does regard Palestinians as useful for another purpose, which is not labor exploitation, but rather experimentation. And investigative journalist Antony Lowenstein and others before and after him have frequently used the phrase the Palestine laboratory to describe how Israel relies on Palestine as sort of a testing ground or proving ground for arms and surveillance technologies that it then exports to other countries. And we know that some of the weapons and technologies that Israel first tested in this Palestine laboratory have included rockets, aerial defense systems, missiles, cyber weapons, and radar technologies. And Israel is invested in maintaining an occupied population as a resource for experimentation because experts have shown that Israel, without that ability to experiment, Israel could not compete in the international weapons and securitization markets. And this is because Israel's competitive advantage is that the technologies it exports are quote unquote battle tested. They're touting that they were tried on Palestinians as a marketing advantage. And so to give you an example, the ability to experiment on Palestinians has allowed Israel to become the global leader in unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs. It's another term for drones, like the I Heron, who I think that's now sold to countries like Azerbaijan and Brazil and India and Turkey. But basically, since the mid 1980s, Israel's the sort of UAV research and development in Israel has operated at a rapid pace thanks to 4 decades of consistent use and iteration in its occupation in Palestine. And now this has led to Israel becoming the top global exporter of UAVs, and they account for 60.7% of sales worldwide. So 60.7% of drones worldwide have been sold by Israel. So how does that impact sort of the artificial intelligence universe? Israel has very much embraced AI as part of its military strategy. It has recognized the value of AI that it's now using to augment weaponry like UAVs, but also armored vehicles, networked sensor systems for real-time battlefield data, and microcomputer outfitted rifles like the Elbit's RCAS that I'm showing here, and more. And if you are not familiar with AI broadly, it's a fairly nebulous umbrella term that encompasses a wide range of technologies. But what they have in common is their need for data, because they need data to train models, to recognize patterns or make predictions. They need data to test their models and to assess their performance. And they need data to operate functions like optimization, processing, or automation. So this means that Israel needs massive amounts of data for their AI systems. And so when you consider Palestinians as experimentation subjects, we have to consider them as sites of data capture. And what AI does is that it introduces a duality where both Palestinian lives and Palestinian deaths are generating data points for Israel's systems of warfare. When you think about Palestinian lives, the sort of incessant tracking and monitoring of Palestinians can only be fittingly termed as data dispossession. Israel deploys a wide range of surveillance mechanisms that include license plate scanning, wiretapping, infiltrating social media accounts and telecommunications infrastructure, recording CCTV footage, drone, satellite footage, capturing data from motion and heat sensors, deploying biometric data surveillance like startup AnyVision's network of over 115,000 facial recognition cameras throughout the West Bank. And so without Palestinians being alive, without walking through checkpoints, driving, making phone calls, using social media, Israel would not be able to obtain the data needed to target them. But what's more, I think in addition to their lives, the deaths of Palestinians are too turned into data points for Israel to fine-tune and demonstrate the effectiveness of its lethal technologies. Because AI requires sort of a constant data feedback loop, data from the lives of Palestinians facilitate targeting them in the moment. And then data from their targeting and potentially killing that improves the precision of future targeting. So I'll share an example. Spice 250 is an AI system that is fitted on the wings of bomb-carrying warplanes. And this system claims that it has the capacity for future deep learning to be based on data extracted from earlier launches, and this is a quote. So it does so by simultaneously assessing the data of the damage caused by bombs in one strike mission, and then using that data to improve the system's model and thus its lethality in future strike missions. Now, the data dispossessed from Palestinians in dying not only serves to refine Israel's AI systems, but also to prove their worth. Months after, I think it was a couple of months after October 2023, Israeli startups like Exxon Vision were already advertising that their product's precision has improved from their deployment in Gaza in the hopes of increasing their marketability to potential buyers. It has been reported that in sort of international weapons expositions, many Israeli companies actually show footage of their technologies targeting Israelis, including targets or sort of strikes that have led to the deaths of Palestinians. So I want to talk about this sort of term necropolitics. If you're not familiar with it, it was theorized by scholar Achille Mbembe that refers to the politics of subjugating living beings to the power of death. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but Israel's necropolitical practices have been long documented over the years. They have included torturing and killing detained Palestinian political prisoners, maiming Palestinian bodies, attacking healthcare and life-sustaining infrastructure, imposing restrictions on Palestinians who were seeking medical treatment, harvesting organs from dead Palestinians, and freezing and withholding their bodies from their families. And when you think about necropolitics as an analytical framework, I think it offers us three key interventions. One is that this notion of death worlds, which is defined as, and I quote, new and unique forms of social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. A second intervention is that death worlds are produced by weapons that are deployed in the interest of maximally destroying persons. And then a third is that when it comes to areas that are governed by a state of siege, those areas become the sites where entire populations are the target. And so for context, two algorithmic systems for target generation that were reported to be in Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza. One is Gospel, which marks buildings as targets for airstrikes. And the second is Lavender, which identifies human targets and generates kill lists. And I think these systems exemplify the three features of necropolitics that are articulated previously. First, the data needs of these systems require Palestinians to essentially be living death because they have to be alive enough to be dispossessed of data that's used to target them and enhance the lethality of the tools that continue to deliver their deaths. Then second, these systems generate targets at what they say is unprecedented scale compared to previous modes of target identification, granting Israel the ability to maximally target people en masse and execute far more airstrikes than previously possible, though this could be debated. And then third, these systems enable the rendering of the entire population of residents in Gaza as potential targets. So, for instance, Lavender takes the personal data of Palestinians to assign each individual a rating. And supposedly, when a person's rating surpasses a predefined threshold, they are marked as a target to be killed. But and this was reported by the Israeli military itself. After exhausting the list of targets that exceeded that first threshold, officers then would set a new lower threshold that allows them to target even more people. So this sort of calibration of Lavender scoring makes it that any Palestinian in Gaza could be turned into a target at any given time. And these tools are not just responsible for the direct killing and maiming of tens of thousands of Palestinians, potentially hundreds of thousands, but they also contribute to the slower deaths of so many more as a result of the orchestrated and systematic sabotage of life-sustaining infrastructure. And then these tools are subsequently improved upon and either sold by Israeli companies to customer worldwide, or they inspire other tools that are being used in other places. So the same processes that devalue Palestinian lives while valuing Palestinian deaths have turned disposability into a market opportunity. Um, we have heard from journalists that Israel has provided a model in Gaza on how to obliterate a society without serious consequences, at least yet, which is piquing the interest of other forces interested in dealing with populations they deem undesirable in a similar fashion. So, in a sense, to me, Israel is not just selling AI-powered weapons and surveillance systems to willing buyers, it's also selling the blueprint for disposability as a mode of both managing unwanted population, but also as a market opportunity for war profiteering. So I opened with a news headline and I'll end with one. This is a story from less than a month ago that was covered by Dropsite News that investigates Israeli biometric and surveillance technologies by firms like FST Biometrics that were, again, originally field proven through monitoring Palestinians at checkpoints. And then they were later commercialized in Nigeria. And now we know that investors like Jeffrey Epstein and former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who is an investor in those companies, helped broker their sales. And these sales not only generated profits for those companies, but they also benefited the investors who gained geopolitical leverage by becoming embedded in Nigeria's core infrastructure for internal security, energy, logistics, and whatnot. This example and other examples explain why experts are not only decrying the immediate devastating consequences of Israel's algorithmic systems, but they're also warning about the precedent that their use in Palestine is setting. Sources are already suggesting that many nations are looking to Israel and its use of AI in Gaza with admiration and jealousy. And so, short of stopping and putting a stop to the occupation of Palestine and all other imperial ambitions, it's very likely that we will continue to see AI kill lists again and potentially even more terrifying iterations of AI necrotechnology. After all, AI is just the latest tool in the settler colonial and racial capitalist toolbox, and one that reveals the political and economic motivations of institutions that long precede the sort of rise of AI. And yeah, that's it for my presentation, and free Palestine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will take a moment for us to take in all of the appreciation for what you've shared. And as folks are formulating questions for our discussion, I will offer some thoughts, maybe some themes that can help guide our discussion as well. Um, there is a lot. One of the things that, of course, immediately came to mind as you were talking was the role of um, data surveillance technologies in up to and including the use of AI in ICE's operations to surveil and target people for abduction and detention here in the US, and the kinds of links that we can make. I mentioned also just before you started speaking about the sort of news, been in the news about the US strike on the girls' school in Iran. And alongside of that story has been this other story about Trump canceling Anthropic, the deal with Anthropic and Claude, and moving to OpenAI. Of course, Anthropic is a offshoot of OpenAI that had to do with supposedly internal disputes they had about safety. So we can really see the sort of speaking of necropolitics, the genocidal understanding of safety that they are cultivating in these kind of projects. Um, and so we can say more about that and the details of that. But one other thing that I was struck by as you were talking was this statistic you offered about the UAVs and that Israel is producing 60% or
Selling.
I don't know, produces, selling. Okay, yeah, 60% of them. And something that has been really on my mind in the past couple of weeks is, the echoes of the US invasion of Iraq, the lies that led us there, and thinking about the kinds of echoes that are that pull us through, not to say that they're exactly the same, but to think about that. So the way that the UAV statistic struck me or made me think about it was as I was engaging with your work, I thought about this sort of idea, if for those of you who may remember, can stretch all the way back even to the 1990s in your brains, um, the conversation that was had then about so-called Gulf Storm and the fact that it was talked about as a kind of like video game, the first war that we were watching like a video game on TV screens, something like this. So it got me thinking about that, the sort of lineage or the continuity between that moment up to and through drone actions and the conversations around drones and the kind of like distancing that is involved and the also the video game conversations that happen around that. Um, and of course, drones have not gone away, but the sort of adding on and continuity through to the present moment, those have all often been all of these technologies have often been introduced with the idea of being their precision. They're supposed to be better because they are more precise. They can, in the Gulf storm and then beyond, it was the idea of surgical strikes was introduced. This supposed conceit that it's going to be like cleaner and a better form of war. And I was interested in maybe hearing more about the relationship between that and the ways that people talk about data, that, they sort of marshal data. I think you used the word alibi, or maybe you've in other places thought about or talked about data being used as an alibi in the sense that the action happens and then you can retrospectively perhaps like um, collate whatever form of data you want to make your argument. There's that piece of it, but there's also this question about the way that people present and maybe even understand data as objective, as neutral, as um, as like more valid or something in that sense. So the precision and data piece maybe is the sort of question that I'll offer first, and then I'll attend to the chat and now that folks
Uh,
have had a chance to formulate.
no, thank you for this question. I think there's like a few different threads maybe that I want to pull from it. But I definitely agree with you in sort of I appreciate your historization from the War of Iraq, and also I think we can see how we're following that same like lineage of like both like geographic like distancing, like being able to, there's like a video game you can like um um uh bombard or like strike people from afar, and they're just sort of like geographic or like physical distancing, and there's also this sort of distancing of like responsibility that we're seeing with the datafication and the use of um language that's about like we're being more responsible, we're being more surgical, we're being more precise. um and yeah, I think the reliance on data and the sort of like the language of datafication and AI being more objective and neutral does perpetuate that same myth of, the surgical strikes and even like Israel's use throughout the year of the idea of like precision munitions, which, by the way, if you didn't know, because I had to learn this, precision munition doesn't actually mean that they're less likely to lead to collateral damage, meaning that it's more discriminate. It just means that it's more likely to hit their target. Anyway, but most importantly, I think it allows what you were talking about, the sort of retroactivity. It allows Israel to have a sense of like certainty that it can always legitimate and cohere its actions when they come under scrutiny. And they have claimed this themselves. This is not my analysis or other people's analysis. They'll say if they need to justify the killing or the detainment of somebody, they can go to the database and find something to justify that action, and which is why I call it like a genocidal alibi. um the sort of like massive and voraciously, like endlessly voracious, like amounts of data that are being collected are serve this purpose, serve this sort of legitimation or retroactive legitimation purpose. And so under the guise of like it being data informed and it being precise, we're sort of seeing this idea of impunity, really, or the ability to sort of keep a front where you are being legitimate while while conducting literal genocidal campaign. And we understand that that is an important function of the Israeli like polity or project, at least at the international stage, because they've created like a legitimacy cell during like a few months after October 2023 within sort of the Israeli military structures as a way to justify like actions that all of a sudden you know become headlines internationally, and as we've seen in the cases of hospitals that were being bombed and whatnot. um so I think this sort of like, and one can make the case that when you think about the sheer sort of damage and devastations that have happened over the last like 2 to 3 years in Gaza, does Israel even need a target generation system to tell it, to say, here are the different targets that you need to be striking? One could argue that it really, what's the purpose of that, especially if you can just, calibrate it and target anybody that you wish, right? Um, and so I think it really comes back to this idea of um, how are you able to justify or sort of like add a veneer of legitimacy to actions after the fact?
Yeah, thank you. There are at least three questions in the chat, so I'm gonna start to facilitate that a little bit. I almost want to save the first conversation for later, but I'm gonna introduce it first since it was there. And there's a sort of conversation about how I'm wondering if you've noticed patterns of disruption in which we can intervene, specifically in um, you know, data kinds of trajectories. So the larger question is, having followed the patterns in which these technologies become adopted and transition, are there potential weak points that can ruin the trajectory? Someone suggested not using AI, and then there was a conversation about, well, whether that's abstinence rather than disruption and what disruption might look like.
Yeah, I think I want to draw a parallel in, I don't remember what decade, but when conversations around like carbon footprint started to take hold, and big oil has sort of like building this like marketing campaign around like our individual responsibility for recycling and like flying less and all of that. So I want to acknowledge that there is a similar discourse that's happening right now about our individual usage of like AI systems and whether or not that is going to have or like move the needle as far as like the weaponizations of these systems in context of warfare. Now, what's different from the sort of carbon footprint mythology and today is that there is actually a direct link. Like when we're thinking about, for example, facial recognition and using like Google Photos, for example, for taking photos and storing them and then looking up people. Those tools are actually being used have been used in Gaza to identify folks from footage that the IOF was capturing throughout evacuation corridors. So there is like a direct, because these systems rely on data to improve their accuracy, it's not far-fetched to say it's like there's a like likelihood that your data and my data and other people's data has been used to make these systems um, rigorous enough that they're currently being deployed in places where they have much more devastating consequences. Um, so I wouldn't say that, refraining from using AI systems of biometric systems doesn't have an impact. I think it does. And at the same time, I think that it does not do enough to um, make this sort of like broader military industrial complex adoption of AI crumble in any way. And I think this is where sort of broader like supply chain um, disruptions need to happen. I think, for example, of the work that a lot of Microsoft workers and investors have been doing after the investigations that came and that revealed like the use of Microsoft Cloud Azure by the IOF to store millions and billions of hours of phone calls that were intercepted and recorded from Palestinians. And those troves of data are being used, have been leveraged for Lavender and then other purposes. And I think of the sort of work that has led to at least the cancellation of one of those contracts from Microsoft. Now there's like a lot more to be done. There are more contracts than we now know that Amazon AWS is also being used by the IOF. But I think that there's a lot more to be done in that realm of disrupting the supply chain. Unfortunately, like algorithmic supply chains just like encompass so many different actors. Like we're thinking about who's using the data, but who's providing like the storage and who's providing the actual model, and there may be different models. And I think sometimes like when we talk about it in the AI world, it's like the problem of many hands. But I think actually the problem of many hands then offers us like multiple opportunities and like touch points for leverage. I don't know that we have a lot to, influence like the IOF's like internal technology development, but I think we have a little bit more leverage in terms of influencing big tech, influencing some of the smaller companies that are being um, um, yeah, whose technology is being used to augment or support these larger systems.
Thank you for that. So I have three on deck, at least questions, and I'm just going to take them in the order in which they were posted. Um, there's another one about asking about, thank you for this impressive and devastating work. I'm wondering if you could elaborate more on how these technologies are used inside prisons. Do you know how they're currently been used in U.S. carceral settings?
This is another area of my research that I've been looking into. Um, So one clear example to me is I've talked a little bit about voice surveillance, the sort of the one that Microsoft has been shown to be storing and supporting. Um, Sort of the same logics that we've now come to have normalized as a society, not us individually, of systematically recording and weaponizing the phone calls of entire populations, including in US prisons, but also in Palestine. They follow extremely similar, both like technical underpinnings and also sort of carceral and population control logics. Like nowadays, when you think about US prisons, it's not just about, oh, you're going to have a human in another room um, thinking, oh, this is like a particular person of interest that we need to be surveilling. I'm going to listen in on their calls. And then if there's something to flag, then there's going to be an immediate action. We're talking about recording everybody, and we're talking about no human is listening to it. There's sort of systems of transcription, of like keyword flagging, of voice printing that are doing all of that analysis in the background. And some of it are also doing some decision making in the background. And by the way, this is like entirely unconsented to by prisoners. There's this sort of like the voice that tells you, your call is going to be recorded, and I don't know that entails consent. But most specifically, when we're talking about voice printing is this idea of turning a voice into a biometric marker, meaning that it allows you to identify a speaker from any voice recording. those have explicitly been like that voice, like the biometric enrollment has specifically been made either covertly, like prisoners did not know that it was happening, or they did know and they were told that if they didn't go through with it, then they would lose their privilege of making calls. Um, Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought of where I was trying to go with this, but I think that that sort of like similarity of like the weaponization of the communication needs of an entire population is happening both in Palestine and it's happening also in US prisons. And now there's even a model that's being piloted where they're taking the years and years of data of phone recordings of US prisoners to build a model that doesn't tell you when people are planning to commit a crime, quote unquote crime, but when they're contemplating the potential for planning and so we're getting to this like pre-crime like area of work that is very reminiscent also of the kind of language that the sort of Zionist occupation has about or like uses to justify the mass surveillance that it's conducting in Palestine.
Yeah, and just the logic of preemption in general. And I think your comments also in response to this question really highlight the concept of data dispossession that you are working with in the essay and in your talk. And just thinking about that idea of dispossession in relation to the modes of extraction and harvesting and all the layers of it, I think we could also do more with that,
Absolutely.
or say more, have more discussion. The next question is actually from someone, Veronica, that I want to mention, had noted that I maybe overgeneralized the question around the first question about how to disrupt. Um, uh, and so there's something in there about models that maybe we could come back to as well, like how are the models built and thinking more about that. But the question in the chat is, I would be interested to know since when is Israel using AI as a war tool? And could you explain a bit more on the tentacular activities of Epstein and share some academic sources? And last but not least, is it about control of all the region by the US, Israel? Is Germany a key player here?
I may not have answers to all of these questions. So first about the models, we don't know how these models are built. They won't let us know how these models are built because they want to keep them proprietary. Um, and adding to the sort of layer of opacity is that sometimes these models are not accessed directly. So for example, OpenAI as far as we know currently, doesn't have direct contracts with Israel, but Israel accesses OpenAI's models through Microsoft. And I think in the case of Claude of Anthropic, that was the case also with I think some contracts with Palantir. I mean, I feel like there's like all manners of layers of complexity that make it even harder to know what exactly is being used and like what's the sort of technology stack. And a lot of what we know is from like scavenging data here and there for what is publicly available and from sort of internal like employees or whistleblowers sharing information. So it's extremely incomplete picture of what I know to be or I believe to be like a much bigger like submerged iceberg that we don't know of. I think the second question was about the tentacular. Is that how you pronounce the word tentacular activities of Epstein? I don't know. I don't know that there are academic sources on that. I know that the sort of investigation from Dropsite News was one of the investigations that like directly linked him in sort of like these dealings with Israel. I do know. I feel like I've read a long time ago that we have Epstein to blame for introducing Palantir to, at the time, Ehud Barak was the prime minister in Israel. I frankly don't know a lot of the details of that to speak confidently about it, but I'm happy to look into it and share sources. I don't know that there are academic sources. I'd venture to say it's more on the journalism side of things. And the last question about control of the region, you know, as far as like history tells us, I think we can definitely see some patterns there, and we can definitely see some um like repeated history as far as like who anyway, I don't want to speak to that because I
Yeah.
yeah. I
And
think
I think, yeah, the Epstein files are, of course, all of the news about that is unfolding. So, of course, yeah, I think it's mostly journalism. In your comments made me also think of, I had used the phrase information warfare in my brief intro, but I just wanted to add that as part of it. The obscurity, the silences, the censorship, the overt censorship, that is all part, of course, like a really important part of this information warfare as well. Um, there's another question about gaming.
Mhm.
Can you speak to the need to see gaming from more than a colonial lens? For example, whereas gaming can disconnect settler colonials and desensitize them to genocide at times. And apologies if I'm the one who introduced that framing. I don't know if that was what you spoke to, but I have heard from people who were living in occupied Gaza utilize the gaming technology for play connection while staying sheltered from IOF violence, maybe seizing live from the death world. And do you think there's a parallel to AI usage and beliefs?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I think I don't really have a take on gaming, broadly speaking. I certainly don't have a take on like whether, Fortnite type games are bad or good. Um, I think like sort of cultural studies and media studies scholars have sort of spoken to the idea of the ways that war um, and genocidal campaigns are increasingly portrayed in this sort of like game-like aesthetics um, has contributed to some sort of like popular desensitization of what's happening. But yeah, I think I have not spoken to that, and it's not my area of work, but there's definitely work there on that. And I definitely have nothing about Palestinians using or like playing games. Yeah.
I actually heard a really great paper about it at the most recent Mesa. If I can remember and find the link, I can maybe put it in the chat. But it was precisely in response to that. It was about Palestinians playing. Um, but I think it may have even been like hacking a video game to play it in a new way. Um, and precisely toward connection and that sort of thing. Um, there is another question from Preeti Patel. This is an extremely pointed critique of AI imperialism and its intersection as a rising fascist project, deeply embedded in necropolitics, per your contextualization of geopolitical actors as they participate and cohere in the colonial nightmare of war. I was thinking the implication for things like ashrams for war criminals in India as AI complicates the relation of citizens slash soldiers to the project of war as it plays out in mechanized, disembodied ways to further empire and its justifications. So re-invoking the idea of genocidal alibi.
Was there a question?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I know I'm not sure how to frame it as a question either. Um, and in the interest of time, but feel free to put more in the chat to follow up. Um, uh, another question asking you and others here, are there any decentralized networks or platforms that offer training for people under occupation about data and data evasion? So back to maybe data evasion as a form of disruption. I think someone else had suggested data pollution as a form of disruption. What are ways people under occupation within carceral systems can protect themselves? And what does that look like in practice? So sort of returning to that.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't heard of trainings that are being offered to people under occupation about sort of adversarial practices around data. But I'm sure people are resisting in ways that we're not even familiar with, as far as like, and we've seen this, anytime that there are efforts to surveil people that then sort of like lead to self-censorship. I mean, there's always, code words and like different ways of communicating that people, at least I'm more familiar with it as far as like voice surveillance is concerned. And so when you're like recording people as they're speaking, there's definitely ways that you either communicate outside of what could be captured or intercepted, or you communicate in ways that are not as legible and understandable by whomever is listening in and whomever is analyzing the data. Um, I do know that there are plenty of efforts to sort of disrupt or yeah, just like be adversarial against technologies like facial recognition and like license plate scanning. And there's makeup and there's like outfit like clothing and there's like what was the somebody had created an app I think that like would inform you if there's like people who are wearing the Meta like Ray-Ban camera outfitted. So like there's these sort of interventions that are happening, which are encouraging and exciting. And I also think that like there's this sort of traditional, maybe less like exciting work of getting like public policy to ban facial recognition entirely in like certain areas. Not that, they can always find workarounds, but we've seen this a lot. But yeah, I think it's like a multitude of tactics that could be used in conjunction with one another to really put friction at every level in terms of the use of these technologies. And I also want to call out like the work of a lot of grassroots organizers that are sort of tackling like very specific carceral surveillance technologies, whether it's like license plate scanners or sort of acoustic like gunshot detection tools, whether it's facial recognition. And that work is very thankless and requires a lot of like showing up every day to try to move, city council members and other elected officials, and like the companies that are developing these technologies. And I think it's like very much like in the same way that we are being captured in a net that is cast by a wide range of actors. I think there's also like a wide net of potential tactics that could be um, leveraged to yeah, counter that capture.
Yeah, I know Flock and ShotSpotter are some of those that folks are posing right now. Thinking more about the model, I think this is sort of something that's happening in the chat as well. But if we go back to the Anthropic OpenAI example, I could, and I'll just give like a quick contextualizing thing around the girls' school, which is that you all may have heard and read the reports that talk about how the girls' school is near to Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval base, and that, this seems to have been maybe there was going to be somebody trying to justify it in that way, but it's clearly walled off, and it clearly, from satellite imagery for at least a decade, has been clearly marked as not part of that naval base. And yet, one can imagine that Anthropic AI's model, or that the way that the data is trained, that it could have made this mistake to think that it was part of it and then to suggest it as a strike. So that raises a question about this way that I know I've heard folks talk about how one of the huge dangers of AI in military use is that it can be used in this way to say like, oh, well, it was a mistake to evade accountability. Like it was just the AI mistake. It was not our mistake. We were doing everything like as we should have, and by international law or whatever justification would be made, is sort of one tack. And another around models, or that's one question. That's a big question, but another around models that I wanted to sort of like encapsulate because I think people are maybe circling around it is this question of OpenAI and Anthropic and all of them, XAI, all of these, they are the amount of compute that they need to train these massive models makes them voracious harvesters of data in all these horrific ways that you've been talking about. And they have scaled up and wanting to scale up at this accelerated speed that sort of parallels the accelerated genocide in a way, And but there could be people who would suggest that the problem is that speed and scale. So I know that there are folks who talk about, for instance, like a feminist model of AI. This is just one example, and that the principles of that kind of building a model for AI would privilege centering community members who are impacted by it, having a specific um, need for it. So Karen Howe, who wrote The Empire of AI about OpenAI, talks, for instance, about the example of developing a model that's trained to help keep a language alive that is like that, and it would serve that community of language speakers. That it would be slow, that it would be accountable, all of these things. So that's another sort of massive question. Like, is that what we should be engaging? That there are these other ways of thinking about building AI models, and what we really need to understand is that the problem is the massive compute scale and capitalist profit drive.
Yeah, I actually have I have a way to answer both the accountability question and the sort of scale question. Because yes, I mean, it's definitely sort of a reliance on these AI models, even when people, and including Israel, are talking about like having a human in the loop and sort of having somebody embedded in the system that can double check whether the decision is right or whatnot. It definitely is a tool of like the distance and responsibility. And you know, Israel themselves, they're sort of like they talk about it where in a way where they can just like fold errors in like the statistical calculation of collateral damage. They'll say things like, you know, even if you don't know for sure that the machine is right, you know that statistically is just fine, so you just go for it. Um, but what I want to highlight about that argument of the precision and accuracy is that when when instances of inaccuracy or errors occur, the sort of like technocratic response to that is how do we improve? Like how do we make it more accurate? How do we make it more precise? And that eventually leads to a call for let's make the data more diverse. Let's make the data more comprehensive. Let's make the data not have like blind spots. And what that means is let's capture even more data and sort of like let's increase the scale of what we're capturing, you know, the voracious amounts of data that are already being captured. And so it really is like a perverse sort of cycle of the problem that exists in the first place is being resolved by amplifying the problem even more. Um, and yeah, I think it goes back to your last point. I have a lot of skepticism around like, you know, there's like feminist approaches to AI and decolonial approaches to AI and all of these like queer, you know, all of these different sort of like critical lenses to look at AI. I do personally believe that there is absolutely no reason for us to have sort of like these giant general purpose large language models. There just isn't. It doesn't make sense. This is my personal opinion. It just doesn't make sense from an environmental standpoint, from a usage standpoint. Like we really don't need to have a single tool that can be your therapist and the thing that gives you like shopping lists and can be used to, you know, generate military targets and other things, right? Um, Before AI became this sort of like big, and I want to talk about that specifically because the more you make it general purpose, the more it really like destroys our planet. Like the compute that it requires, the amount of water and land and energy that it requires is just bananas. Uh, but then when you think about before AI became this sort of like marketing term that VCs are flocking around, there have been for decades, like smaller sort of algorithmic models that have specific purposes. And because they had specific purposes, they had smaller data sets that they were trained on that they would draw from, um, and that were not as environmentally destructive and are not sort of driving this like mania of let's put AI into everything. Um, I would say I would be more open to arguing for the usefulness of those models. Now, I would have to look at which ones. I know in the chat somebody shared about biodiversity conservation, but I think there's like a little bit of an oxymoron or like in having like environmental models when AI, broadly speaking, is so environmentally destructive. But I think there is a case to be made for like single purpose models that could be less destructive and that could make sense. But I definitely draw the line at no one actually needs a large language, like a general purpose large language models, and I will die on that hill.
It might be a helpful closing point. I think we're sort of out of time. But I just want to reiterate the deep thanks for the gratitude for your work in general and for coming to share, converse with us about it. I put the links to your essays in the chat. And thank you everyone for joining us today as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for your questions. And also thank you for having me. I really appreciated having this conversation. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.